In today's lecture, we are going to talk about the peripheral nervous system. Before talking about the peripheral nervous system, recall that the central nervous system is a part of the nervous system that is centrally located, and it consists of two organs, the brain and the spinal cord. In contrast, the peripheral nervous system is everything outside of the central nervous system, and it too consists of two things. One is called spinal nerves, and the other one are what we call cranial nerves. So let's take a closer look at nerves. A nerve are bundles of myelinated axons, and these axons can either come from sensory neurons or motor neurons or both. And there are two types of nerves found in the nervous system. The first type of nerve are what we call cranial nerves, and these are nerves that enter and exit the brain. The second type of nerve are called spinal nerves, and spinal nerves are nerves that enter and exit the spinal cord. The first type of nerve that we are going to discuss are the nerves that enter and exit the brain, called cranial nerves. In order to take a closer look at the cranial nerves, we are looking at the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem from an inferior view. So taking a look at the cranial nerves, you'll notice that there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Cranial nerves can have a multitude of functions. One function is a sensory function. If a cranial nerve has sensory function, it is going to be involved with the special senses, such as vision, hearing, taste, and smell. Cranial nerves are also going to be responsible for the general senses, such as temperature, pain, and other regulatory mechanisms to maintain homeostasis. Another function of cranial nerves would be the motor function, and motor function can involve the controlling of skeletal muscles, which is controlled by a subdivision of the peripheral nervous system called the somatic nervous system, but it also means the control of smooth muscle and cardiac muscle, along with glands. These are controlled by the autonomic nervous system of the peripheral nervous system. And finally, the last function is a mixed function. And a mixed function simply means that a cranial nerve has both motor function and sensory function. And the type of nerve that you would find within the mixed function is a mixed nerve, which is a nerve that contains both a sensory nerve and a motor nerve. For our scope of the class, we're going to focus on the cranial nerves that are associated with the special senses. So make sure you pay particular close attention to those cranial nerves. The first cranial nerve is cranial nerve number 1, the olfactory nerve, which is involved with the sense of smell. The next cranial nerve is cranial nerve number 2, the optic nerve, which is involved with the sense of vision. The next nerve is the intermediate nerve that is actually part of cranial nerve number 7, the facial nerve. And this nerve, the intermediate nerve, is associated with the sense of taste, along with cranial nerve number 9, the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is also associated with the sense of taste. And finally, the last cranial nerve that we're going to focus on is cranial nerve number 8, which is the vestibular cochlear nerve, and this is responsible for the sense of hearing along with the sense of balance. You may want to take a moment to take a look at the rest of the cranial nerves and see what they are associated with in terms of their sensory and motor functions. The last type of nerves that we are going to discuss are the nerves that enter and exit the spinal cord, called spinal nerves. Spinal nerves are all mixed nerves. In other words, they both contain motor and sensory axons. In the illustration, you can see some of the main nerves and the areas of the body that they are associated with. For example, the radial nerve, which will feed into the lower forearm, specifically on the radius side. You have the ulnar nerve, which will also feed into the forearm on the ulnar side. Then you have the phrenic nerve, which is responsible for controlling the actions of the diaphragm. And then the femoral nerve, which will be located along the femur and feed into the leg and lower leg. Next, we're going to take a look at the divisions of the peripheral nervous system. And there are two major divisions of the peripheral nervous system. The first division is the sensory division. The second division is the motor division, and the motor division can be further subdivided into two divisions. The first one being the somatic nervous system, the next one being the autonomic nervous system. And finally, the autonomic nervous system can be further subdivided into two divisions. One is called the sympathetic division, and the last one is called the parasympathetic division. Taking a closer look at the sensory division contains sensory neurons, which conduct their action potentials from the periphery to the central nervous system. So within the sensory division, you have sensory receptors that are responsible for, in essence, sensation. And when this sensation is realized, they create an action potential that is sent through the sensory neuron up towards and through the dorsal root into the spinal cord, which is part of the central nervous system. And since we're talking about the spinal cord, the bundle of axons of these sensory neurons would be sensory nerves, which ultimately are peripheral nerves. In contrast, if we were talking about a bundle of axons of sensory nerves that lead into the brain, we would be talking about cranial nerves. The second division of the peripheral nervous system is the motor division, and the motor division contains motor neurons, and these motor neurons conduct their action potentials from the central nervous system to the peripheral nervous system, specifically to the effector organs or muscles. So in this illustration here, you can see that any signal that would come from the primary motor cortex of the cerebrum would travel down the spinal cord, exit through a motor neuron through the ventral root, and then ultimately lead to an effector organ, in this case, a skeletal muscle tissue, causing a motor response. The motor division can be further subdivided into two subdivisions. The first one is called the somatic nervous system, and the second one is called the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is part of the motor division that is responsible for controlling voluntary movements. Recall that voluntary means under conscious control, so these are movements that we can actually control, which means action potentials are transmitted from the central nervous system, most likely from the primary motor cortex of the cerebrum, to skeletal muscles. However, there is a mechanism of the somatic nervous system that does initiate involuntary movements, and this is called a reflex. A reflex is an involuntary reaction in response to a stimulus applied to the periphery and transmitted to the central nervous system. Taking a closer look at a reflex consists of a reflex arc, which is a neural pathway, and there are 5 parts of a reflex arc. The first part is what we call the sensory receptor. The second part is called the sensory neuron. The third part is the interneuron. The fourth part is the motor neuron. And the fifth part is the effector organ. There are different types of reflexes within the somatic nervous system. The first reflex is called the stretch reflex. And during a stretch reflex, muscles contract in response to a stretching force applied to them. In the illustration you see here, this is the knee-jerk reflex. During the knee-jerk reflex, a reflex hammer strikes the patellar tendon, causing stretch receptors in the quadriceps muscles to create an action potential. That action potential is then passed on through a sensory neuron, which ultimately gets passed to a motor neuron that stimulates the quadriceps muscles to contract, extending the lower leg, hence the knee jerk. The second type of reflex found within the somatic nervous system is the withdrawal reflex. And during withdrawal reflex, a limb is removed from a painful stimulus. In the example shown here, a sharp object is accidentally touched. Pain receptors create an action potential and transmit that action potential through a sensory neuron, and that action potential is passed on to an interneuron, which is then passed on to a motor neuron. And that motor neuron will eventually stimulate skeletal muscles, causing the, in this case, forearm to be withdrawn from the sharp object. The second subdivision of the motor division is called the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is responsible for controlling involuntary movements. Recall that involuntary means not under conscious control, so these are actions of muscles that we cannot control. The action potentials created in the autonomic nervous system are transmitted from the central nervous system to cardiac muscles, smooth muscles, and glands. Another responsibility of the autonomic nervous system is that the autonomic nervous system controls organ functions during normal times and during times of stress. And there are two subdivisions of the autonomic nervous system that are related to normal times and times of stress. The first subdivision is called the sympathetic division, and the second subdivision is called the parasympathetic division. Comparing the two subdivisions of the autonomic nervous system, we see that the sympathetic division prepares a person for physical activity, is activated during stress, and is also called the fight or flight response. When we look at the parasympathetic division, we see that the parasympathetic division stimulates vegetative activities, is activated during all other times outside of stress and non-physical activities. In other words, it's activated during at rest, and it is known as the rest and digest response. Taking a closer look at the two subdivisions of the autonomic nervous system, we can see that the sympathetic nervous system, or fight or flight response, is in charge of the following things. So for example, when you're being chased by a tiger, which is a stressful situation, your pupils will dilate, your heart rate will increase, and your airways will be relaxed, so that when you are running away from the tiger, you are circulating blood throughout your body quickly, and you are bringing more air into your lungs. In contrast, when looking at the parasympathetic nervous system, or the rest and digest response, you see that the mechanisms that the parasympathetic nervous system controls are opposite to what the sympathetic nervous system controls. For example, in the sympathetic nervous system, during fight or flight, the pupils dilate, whereas during rest and digest, the parasympathetic nervous system controls the constriction of pupils.